Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, there was a bit of a delay in starting the call. We were figuring out some Zoom logistics. But thank you so much for your patience. I think we have all the speakers and we have a good enough number to kick off um, our first Green Steel 60 session for 2026. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome. I'm Kinshu, and I lead our work on the India Green Steel Network at Climate Catalyst. As I said, this is our first Green Steel 60 session for 2026, hosted by the India Green Steel Network. And I hope everyone had a great weekend. And thank you for taking out the time to be with us on a Monday afternoon. Next slide, please. Before we begin, it'll be great if all of us could introduce ourselves in the chat with your name, your organization, and where you're joining us from. Go on to the next slide. Okay, before we begin, let's quickly take you to today's agenda. We will begin with a presentation from Karthik Shetty, who's a consultant at Council on Energy, Environment and Water, whose presentation will focus on what is needed to kickstart both public and private procurement for green steel in India. This will be followed by a presentation by Nandan Shayalya and Govind Vashisht, Nandan from Climate Catalyst and Govind from CII, and their presentation will focus on the findings from their new report on green public procurement readiness in India. After both the presentations, we will open the floor for questions, and we'll close the session with a quick poll. Next slide, please. To those of you who are not familiar with Green Steel 60 sessions, these are quarterly 60-minute knowledge sharing sessions where we bring together evidence, insights, and ongoing work from across the steel community, both in India and globally. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll begin today's session then with our first presentation. We know that green public procurement has featured prominently in the Ministry of Steel's roadmap for greening the steel sector. But what does it actually take to make it work in practice? We will begin today's session with presentation by Karthik Shetty, who's a consultant at the Council for Energy, Environment and Water. His presentation will address the three big challenges facing green procurement in India, which is cost, availability, and quality. He'll also help answer what practical steps the government can take to kickstart not just public, but also private procurement in India. Karthik, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you. Karthik, your audio is not audible. Do you want to try again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Kinshu. So I'll be starting on this presentation. Before we start, I would like to say that this work is still in our preliminary stage. We haven't finalized our research, and we would like to show what we are doing so far, and some of our work is still pending, and the thesis may change with what we find next. Secondly, why we wanted to look at this is because we were knowledge partners with the Ministry of Steel for the Greening Steel India report, where we worked on taxonomy as well as on green public procurement. So the report was launched on September 2024, followed by the taxonomy in December 2024. But the progress on green public procurement has not been what we envisioned, mainly because post the taxonomy, people have started registering for the green steel, and many people have also gotten certifications. But there were questions raised in Lok Sabha on what is the progress on national mission on green steel and what is the progress on green public procurement. And the answers for these questions were uncertain. Initially, they said that there were 15,000 crore rupees marked for a national mission on green steel. However, included also a PLI scheme for green steel procurement. However, the progress uh, has since stalled. So we wanted to look at where the supply is at and what can we do to get this program started. This procurement scheme for both the public as well as for private procurement. Um, So to begin with, next slide. As Kinshu said, I am Karthik Shetty. I'm a consultant in CEEW. We are a think tank and we work with data in integrated analysis and strategic outreach. We have three verticals and 15 teams, which includes transformations, quality of life, and enablers. So I work with the industrial sustainability team, which is about decarbonizing hard to abate sectors like steel, cement, aluminum, and fertilizers. We are about 400 people, and we have four special initiatives: Finance Center, Powering Livelihoods, Emerging Economics, and UP State Office. That's about us. Next slide. Okay. Uh, so we saw there are green steel certifications, and in last April, there was a CCTS targets for steel players as well, under which there were around 253 steel units. So we tried to compare what green steel certifications data say and what CCTS targets say. In the NIST targets, most of the certificates are for secondary steel units as well as finished steel makers. Therefore, they are certifying part of their production, um, and this enables nearby steel supply, and plainly where the demand centers are in Gujarat, Maharashtra, northern India, etc. Whereas CCTS targets are for primary producers of steel, and it is seen for per ton of crude steel. Here, there are targets for almost 95% of the steel production. And under this, we found that seven factories have both NIST and CCTS targets, NIST certifications as well as CCTS targets. And they have, here we have seen they only cover around, some plants have 2% of their targets in NIST, and some plants have 90% certified. So we can see as the companies start meeting CCTS targets, we will have more steel available as green steel. Then we did some number analysis. Basically, we found that average intensity of green steel is around 1.39, which indicates that most of the steel that is getting certified is green, is five-star steel, and it is dominated by secondary steel units.
दिक्कत हो गई क्या?
Recently, A&MS became the
नहीं,
first integrated
टीवी में
steel
हम सोती
provider.
रहती है ये वैसे टीवी की आवाज में सो जाती है।
Hello.
Akansha, could you please mute yourself? Go ahead,
Okay.
Karthik. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. So let's go to the next slide if this is clear. Once we had that, then we looked at the challenges. In terms of availability, we could see that there is some green steel availability. Again, most of this is by your secondary steel units. Hence, for government procurement, it could be a challenge because currently only like 3% of the green steel is coming from ISPs. But when if the CCTS targets are met in 2027, then about 21% of the steel output would be from ISPs. So ISPs also have stringent decarbonization goals, especially the 2030 goals. So we envision more green steel will be available when these targets are met. In terms of cost, we released a Steel MAC report in 2023, in which we showed that if steel units do energy efficiency and renewable energy, they could reduce their emissions by 18 to 15% by reducing cost of steel production. Now, this could be important for many of the players whose emissions lie just between 2.2 and 2.4 tons of emissions per ton of crude steel. And we also see there could be costs for producing green steel. And we did a study with the Ministry of Steel where we show that around if we have a 30% green steel premium, it could increase your overall project cost by 1% to 5% based on how much you blend green steel with actual steel requirement. Now, this cost might be low, but if the end user need to go to net zero, he'll have other costs as well. Hence, any incentives for green steel will help green steel uptake. Third point is about quality. Right now, because secondary steel units are consuming a lot scrap, and this enables them to make green steel at a lower cost and at very low emissions. But your government projects might not be able to procure them because of quality constraints. Now we have seen ISPs are also getting into scrap-based steel manufacturing, and this could help the industry to have a better quality scrap-based steel. And there are also new gas-based steel plants by ISPs. I mean, we have not seen gas-based steel grow since the 90s. So this addition could also enable more green steel and availability. Next slide. Next. Um, Basically, in the left side, we have a cumulative map of green steel availability if they meet the CCTS target. In 2027, about 42 million tons could qualify as green steel. It is important to note that this targets are not that stringent. It's only about a 5% improvement. And based on the previous slide, these can be easily achieved by energy efficiency and renewable energy. In the right-hand side, these are our graphs from our MAC curves, where for different steel-making routes, we show how emissions can decrease with the cost. So initially, if you undertake renewable energy and energy efficiency, your costs would decrease, and that could improve your green steel availability. And many steel units are incentivized. We spoke to some steel units in Bellary of late, and they are saying that the government is willing to procure from them, uh, and they are also willing to reduce cost by funding for energy efficiency and RE, especially if the demand is not projected to grow in the short term. Next slide. Then we did a state level analysis of green steel availability. Here we can see that Maharashtra is absolutely leading in terms of NIST certifications as well as in terms of CCTS. However, your primary production area of Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Karnataka are not currently doing well in terms of NIST, but they could, borrow some learnings from states that are doing well in certifications. And many of these steel productions will have volumes of steel coming under green steel. And states, if they start disclosing the emissions in their steel consumption, that could nudge more green steel consumptions. And scrap-based steel can be used for non-critical projects like housing, and that could also boost your green steel consumption. In the second graph, we can see that mainly three states, Odisha, Maharashtra, and Gujarat, they will dominate in terms of how much green steel will be available. And with some incentives on group captive RE, waste heat recovery, and lowering your open access charges, many units could be pushed towards the more green steel production. Next slide. So finally, coming to our action items. So we want to prioritize green steel wherever there is a cost balance. This means including green steel in when the bids are equivalent under L1 or QCBS schemes. And bids also could be encouraged to disclose what their emissions are. Secondly, if you improve transparency, where your central and state agencies can disclose how much steel they're consuming of what emissions, and this can be done in the private sector as well. This is our third recommendation. The fourth one is to make your star ratings more prominent. Currently, this was envisioned in the taxonomy, but the star ratings need more highlighting. The fifth one is the states and center should work together to accelerate green steel, where they can learn from each other, like especially states like Odisha, Karnataka, Jharkhand, etc., from early leaders in green steel certification. And then you can do some R&D works for improving your scrap-based output, and you can make projects that require green steel uh, to be route agnostic. That is to say, if they meet quality, but you're not seeing what route the steel is coming from, then that could enable more scrap-based and other makers of steel qualify for your green steel procurement. That is about it from me, and happy to answer questions in the questions round.
Hey, thank you so much, Karthik. I love the six-step action plan that you ended the presentation with. I know I have a few questions as well, but I'm sure there are many questions from the audience as well. I would suggest if you have any questions, please do type them out in the chat box, and then we'll come back to them after our second presentation. I think this is a good moment to switch gears and understand where does the green steel market actually stand today. To help answer this, we are very pleased to have Nandan from Climate Catalyst and Govind from CII. Their new report looks at 28 steel producers and 12 public buyers to assess whether producers are in a position to supply and whether public buyers are ready to buy green steel. Govind and Nandan, over to you.
Thank you, Kinshu. Thank you, Karthik, for that great presentation. Lots of complementarities to what we're going to be talking about. Before I get into that, before I get into the presentation, I just want to thank CII because CII has actually done a lot of this work over almost an 8-month period. When we have been working on green public procurement for at least 2.5 years right now, and when we commissioned the study with CI, we began to see that the questions that we were being asked were quite similar. The first questions were how much volume is available, how should a policy be designed, what should the approach be, who are the right actors to engage. And with CI support, I think we've been able to answer some of these questions. So the presentation highlights some of those answers here. The real opportunity for green steel, as you see, is that for GPP, as you see, is that, the volumes of steel by 2030 will increase rapidly. So we expect that almost 62 million tons of steel will be the demand from just public projects. And going into the data a little bit more, I think the percentage of GPP or percentage of procurement is likely to be in the 22 to 27% range. There are different variations of this number, but the broad number is between 22 and 27%. The projects these projects will almost generate around 78 million tons of carbon emissions. So this is fairly significant in terms of what we are actually trying to abate by putting through a policy like this. We also looked at some other numbers like the Ministry of Statistics has, and there are about 721 projects that's really driving the volume of infrastructure investment going forward. And these projects will have steel as one of the main materials that will be procured. So the kind of volume that you will see over the next 5 to 10 years will be quite massive. So that's really where the GPP opportunity is. As I said, we've been working on GPP for a while now. The first study we commissioned in 2022. We looked at how much volumes, what is the percentage emission reduction that is possible from government funded projects, and just indirect impact. Like if for putting together a policy like this, I will link this report as well in the chat box. And then over the last year, one of the things that we've been trying to do is understand how GPP has actually worked in other geographies that have made it work, and what are the very specific lessons India can draw from these examples. So we've looked at California with their Buy Clean California Act, Japan's Green Purchasing Act, and Italy's CAM, or what we eventually call minimum environmental criteria when you translate it from Italian. So these are three very short case studies. I'm going to link this again in the chat and would love to get some feedback from you. All of these have been authored by Sangeet Selvaraju, who's at the London School of Economics. Coming back to the CII study, I think, as I said, what we really tried to do is one, identify steel producers that are capable of actually supplying steel as per the taxonomy that even Karthik talked about. What is the willingness of certain government buyers? I think a lot of people have gotten perspectives of steelmakers, but very few studies out there actually have perspectives of government buyers. In fact, we had not seen too many. We actually don't have a point of view from many of them. So this study, I think, gives us some preliminary indication. And then the third thing that we try to do is identify what are the issues. Like if you actually went to a government buyer and said, what are the three things that are stopping you from procuring green steel? Is it price? Is it quality? Are there something else? What really is it? And then all of this, of course, is how much emission reduction potential is actually possible, because I think that's an important thing to think about. So the study that CII did was I would say fairly comprehensive. We looked at about 28 steel producers. The sampling of this was not done in any particular scientific way. What we did is we ensured that we covered all the large ISPs. We covered a good geographic representation of secondary players, and then we also covered some steel makers that have already received green steel NIST certificates. So that's how the 28 number we came to. And when we did the volumes on this was about 60% of national capacity. So I'd say it's a fairly representative study. And on the public buyers, we've looked at about 12 major buyers, including your very large ones like NHAI, Indian Railways. These are organizations, CPWD. These are buyers that like procure almost 100,000 tons of steel in a year. So it's fairly large number. Before I get into the details of the findings and study, which I'll let Govind take a little bit, but the broad numbers that we looked at this is what the Steel India profile is broadly from 2024-25. That's the one we have data for. If you see that a lot of the SPUs and re-rolling mills are already somewhat green. So that's about 35 to, or as Karthik said, 36 to 42 million tons of steel is already green today. So that's the volumes that of green steel that can be drawn upon. But for the purpose of this study, we have only looked at the ISPs and the SSPs because one, this is really where procurement will drive its volumes from. This is really where most people like the NHAIs or the railways of the world actually have very, very strong quality considerations. They might not, in fact, be able to like procure from re-rolling mills or SPUs, which is why I like Karthik's idea that maybe we can start with old residential buildings or residential buildings as something as a way to channelize the steel. But for the purpose of this study, we have really focused on ISPs and SSPs. NIST, as Karthik also mentioned, has issued about 10 million tons of green steel certificates. It includes mostly your SPU rolling mills and a little couple of, I think, 2 million tons of SSPs. So what we tried to do is we looked at this data, not just CCTS baseline data, of course, is the carbon credit trading scheme is really where you can take some of this data from. Then we've looked at the taxonomy, we did a bunch of stakeholder consultations, and you obviously have your NIST certification. So you triangulate all of this information, and what we have is some volumes of what we think is likely to be available between now and 2030. On the back of this, the data that we have available is till 2027, 2026, 2027. So we've applied three reduction scenarios: a 2% reduction scenario, a 4% reduction scenario, 6% reduction scenario year on year. And if you look at the deck, you'll see some analysis for what we consider is 2, 4, and 6%. And the headline number is that by 2028, if we go via the low reduction pathway, which is almost business as usual as of today, we will likely have 28.2 million tons of green steel or low carbon steel. And medium is a little bit more. I'll explain what the difference between low and medium is. And high, of course, is 55 million tons. Getting into the numbers a little bit more, today we are currently at 4.68 million tons or 4.95, however you want to consider it, but a little less than under 5. But 2028 onwards is really when we began to see the volumes increasing. So you see numbers slowly go up from 12.75 all the way to 28 million tons in 2030. In the medium scenario, again, 2028 is when you begin to see the volume. The only real difference between the low and medium is the amount of um, four-star steel that is likely to come in if we employ the medium scenario. So 11.4 million ton is a big number. So I think it's from what we should aim for. I think the medium scenario is a fairly realistic, but at the same time somewhat ambitious target to achieve. Because if we're going with the low emission scenario, though we will have 28 million tons of steel, a large chunk of it will only be three-star. And this is not going to really spur any deep decarbonization, which is what we should be aiming for. We then applied a mandate percentage, a mandate design of 26% and 37%, which basically means that if a government had to procure steel, how much percentage green can they procure? You might look at this number and say, this is a pretty random number. How did you get 26%? How did you get 37%, right? The answer to that is that these are numbers from what the government itself was planning to do. So till I think last year, there was a lot of momentum on GPP. And we had heard that initially the government had considered a 37% mandate, but then they thought it was slightly unrealistic. They moved it down to 26% is the next thing that we heard. So this is the reason why we considered 26 and 37%. And if you see in this particular case, in 2030, in 26%, we have demand of 16 million tons, but availability of 28 to 30. So this is great news, which basically means that your supply is able to meet demand fairly comfortably. But if you apply a 37% mandate, supply is still able to meet demand in 2030, but there is some small disruption that is likely to happen between in 2028 when demand will rather in fact be much larger than supply. So that's essentially the big difference. If I had to put this in a graph, if you look at the blue line below is demand. If you see in the 26% graph, all the three lines are comfortably above your blue line. But in the 37% mandate, you see some sort of disruption happening towards 2028. Now, this is actually a good thing because I think, when we look at this, you can look at this graph two ways. You can be like, oh, 37% is actually too ambitious. There's good supply, demand is going to far outstrip supply, so we should not consider 37%. But the other way of looking at it is that it's only when these two lines sort of intersect do steelmakers actually get a signal that says, you know what, we actually can ramp up our capacity. This is where GPP goes from being from just a mere policy to an investment sort of shaping tool. And so that is really important. That is really critical. So in summary, I think what is happening is 2027 is really a big year. We see ArcelorMittal, Nippon Steel coming online into the green category. And you will begin to see a lot more near-term gains in energy efficiency, RE. Deeper decarbonization will likely happen post 28 to 30, and that will really depend on DRI, EF taking off. And of course, all the things that we're doing on CCS. So from a volume perspective, I think 28 to 30 million tons is realistic. The high scenario of 55 million tons would be great if we could achieve, but unlikely at this stage. So what we do recommend from a mandate design perspective is threefold. First is at least announce a mandate today. That is an important enough step. We were supposed to do it. It's not happened yet. But if you announce a mandate that says we will begin implementation 2028 onwards, that's a fantastic first step. If organizations, if certain departments want to commit to pilots, this is probably the time to actually think about it and see how the whole thing can be put together. And then 2028 onwards, commit to that 26% mandate, which is essentially 20% 3-star, 5% 4-star, 1% 5-star steel. Tighten the taxonomy at that point, because I think when the taxonomy came about in 2025, there was some alignment that it would be tightened every 3 years. And then 2030 onwards, try and scale this towards a 37% mandate. If that is not possible, at least increase the share of 4 and 5-star steel. So that's kind of what we've recommended. So 26%, I think, will enable the market in the short term, but I think more sort of ambitious mandate will actually reshape investment and supply. Emissions, I won't spend too much time on this. Emissions will reduce between now and 2030 for the sector. And I think the potential for GPP in a 26% mandate is almost 20.20 to 22 million tons of CO2, which is, again, I would say a fairly significant number that can be achieved by this one policy. We've been talking to a lot of different players over the last few years, last few months, and NN Sinha is one such person who's really at the heart and helm of things at the Ministry of Steel. All of the work on Green Steel Mission was really done under his leadership. And everybody, we've spoken to 3 former secretaries of steel. You'll in fact see some of their op-eds come up in the next couple of weeks. But what all of them seem to say is that price is not a concern at infrastructure scale. So of course there is going to be some premium involved, but when you actually look at this at the level of the project, um, even if you put some amount of premium, I think the project cost is between 1 and 1.5%, and this is something even our study confirms. I'll let Govind talk about this a little bit more in detail. Govind, over to you.
Thanks, Nandan. Welcome all. So going forward, Nandan spoke about the availability and those kind of aspects. I am going to talk about our survey itself. Okay, so going forward, what we saw was, like already Karthik had put, the current green steel capacity, quote unquote, is predominantly available in some units in Chhattisgarh, Punjab, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and West Bengal, meaning it's nearest to the benchmark of the taxonomy. We have a significant shortage of scrap. Okay, that is also contributing to what do you say, possible greenness achieving limitations in the product. The next point is quite important. In fact, everybody talks about NG as a lever to reduce the carbon footprint. In fact, in one of the simulations that we saw in one of Chhattisgarh's plant, they had done this. They had run a simulation. In fact, they put up a plant. Okay, so what they found was when you switch from coal DRI to NG-DRI, the reduction in CO2 emissions or GHG emissions for that matter was about 67%, very significant. Okay, but there is the economics there. Say, for example, if we found that about at the DRI level, at the rotary kiln level, it's about, say, 25,000 rupees per ton of DRI. Okay, so what happened is when you do it in the NG route, it's 30 to 33,000 rupees. Okay, that's a high price of about 20-25%. That much is the difference. And one other important factor in their non-adoption of NG is, even though there is supply, there is line supply, they want a guarantee in the price. Okay, and proper offtake arrangements, so that it at least incentivizes. And the belt and the entire area in Raipur is just next to a huge coal field. Okay, so it requires very, very high incentive for them to make the switch. Okay, so that was one of the operations. And most people are not declaring upstream emissions. So even in the CCTS thing, that was not required. So it's not being captured upstream. And then logistics, those emissions are not barely captured. Only plant boundary get supply is being captured as part of the CCTS. So this is a nascent structure that is there, and it needs to go forward now. So mostly we saw that RE is one stage where people are looking at adopting as a lever for reducing their carbon emissions. Okay, about 21 of 28 had RE adoption in some form, many the remainder we saw that it's what is in it for me, and then it's very high capital and it's a statutory investment, not without particular payoff. Okay, because if you see in that belt, electricity cost is about 4 rupees 50 paisa or 5 rupees. It's very difficult to match that with any other source. So that was one of the factors. And also, if you see, there is one he asked how electricity. In fact, if you see in that belt, induction furnace is a big lever. In fact, it is the most efficient method of steel production with about 850 kilowatt hour per ton of crude steel, being the which is much lesser than your other routes of steel production. That could be completely repaired from RE. Okay, that's a utility scale intervention that we are talking. That is definitely a possibility. And then if you see what next we want is that there needs to be the NIST and the global NISST as a framework. It has to align with global frameworks. In fact, there is a news article recently that the carbon market itself would be launched in a couple of months' time. Okay, that would be a very critical development. Once there is new levers such as carbon credits that could come out and make a different economics from all these things. Once the economics and the numbers play out. Okay, so that one is there. And the last point here is to specifically look at the data quality concern. Many of them are not declaring proper data. Many of the steel plants are like obfuscating data, or like because if you see from the previous measure in the PAT scheme, they had to declare energy. Okay, that was like you can get away with some declaration. But when we are looking at it in when we transpose it to the CCTS mechanism, so many places we see that there absurdly low emissions are there. Okay, so that itself is a signal that that is a problem that is being addressed, but that's for another time. So go forward. So one more thing we saw is all the participants that we talked to, 93% are willing to deliver green steel at scale. Okay, if certain enabling conditions are met. What we saw is there is that element of investment. Any green steel that there is a requirement for investment, and then many of the smaller plants are like every cent has to make a return on investment in the near term. They don't have a very long agenda per se. Okay, so those two, and then there is a limitation when it comes to technical capability among the smaller producers. What the producer is asking for, some concessional lending or targeted viability gap funding. See, as on date, what we are seeing is most of the facility that is there is some level of interest subvention. That is all as far as it goes. Okay, or some grant from the government. These are the two primary things that we call green financing, as far as today what we could merely see in Indian context at least. So there is some clear procurement mandates and long-term visibility, and some financial assistance, again, financial enablers. So decarbonization path, if we talk to the leading steel players in the country, what we see is all of them are like very focused on the major steel majors that you see in your screen are all very focused on reducing pathway in different measures. Okay. So some of the levers that we're using is RE, EF, and etc. They are also trialing CCUS and hydrogen, but have to emphasize it is only at the trial stage or at the pilot stage. It is not at a commercial stage. So they're all doing their best. In fact, if you see Tata Steel and even the other private majors and even RINL, Rashtriya Ispat Nigam Limited, this Visakhapatnam Steel, they are very focused on all these WHR or waste heat recovery and efficiency method. These are some of the events that they are lying. AMNS is partly, I'll just one more. AMNS is part of their facility is already declared green. Okay, there are two parts, plant A, plant B. Plant A production has been declared as green steel because of some methodology in the NISST. So that is also something they're working. That is a very good signal for the industry, I'd say. The others are also aspiring and planning to come forth in that route going forward. So I'll focus on steel sale a bit. Most of the sale plants are 3 tons and above per ton of TCS. In the industry average in India is about 2.55 ton of CO2 per ton of crude steel. So here also the main factors come is sale has legacy infrastructure. Okay, so they have to update it. They're saying even when we went to BF, they're mothballing some of their older blast furnaces and scaling up and making larger blast furnaces. That's made very significant difference up. Okay, and then go forward. So when we see from the demand side, we saw that high volume steel, L1 procurement is primarily what drives steel production. As on date, if you're a steel procuring agency in public, you go for L1. You specify a grade, you have to, and about all the steel manufacturers to get enrolled into your this thing. They have to be empaneled first. That's a key thing. Okay, they only then can they bid for your requirement. Okay, and then there is something called the schedule of rates. This figure is notified by all the state governments locally. Okay, if a public utility has got to procure, they have to procure at the schedule of rates only. Okay, so that's a very different thing. Even if a mandate is notified, this has to reflect that. Only then can procurement happen. Okay, go forward. Yeah, and then key one more thing is what we see is local availability. The fact is many of them said, okay, I'll buy green steel, but if the green steel is come from very far away, there is the significant logistical penalty. Okay, and that adds scope 3 emissions, so that is also a big factor, and that has to be available at scale and at the quantities that are required. So these are all possible. That in our observation we saw that huge quantities are only possible by primary steel manufacturer, and the secondary steel manufacturer, even though they are up to the ship, that can be a problem with them. And what we are saying is notify the margin. Okay, that is one of the headlight signals that can be given. If that is there, okay, then things will fall in place like a dominoes. And then carbon credit compensation. This is a developing thing. As the market is notified, we can develop on this further forward. So we spoke to NHI, many of the large deal uptakes. So what an NHI said was they have about one of the largest public procurers is NHI, 12 to 13% of all public procurements. All of them invariably said if there is a mandate by the government, we are duty bound and we'll definitely go and procure. Okay, so that's what we are doing. So go forward. So an agency like NHPC, they procure 100,000 tons. They are a hydro manufacturer, but that's good enough signal for furtherance of green steel. Go forward. So like Karthik, we also modeled scenarios. Here, if you see, even if there is a steel increase in steel cost by 5.5% like we projected, the procurement project is increasing by 0.3 to about 1.2% maximum. So that's something that's doable, even though in absolute cost terms, that can be significantly higher. Proceed. So we are some recommendations I'll just formalize for you. We are also saying start with the green steel mandate. Okay, and as if the green premium is notified, preferential margins of 8 to 15%, and there can be a GST relief. Okay, GST relief brings a big thing to the table, and also viability gap funding related to CCTS that we already discussed. Also, we are suggesting integrate certified green steel procurement to GEM and central procurement portals. So those that is accessible to everybody in the country. Okay, I believe it will be like an Amazon marketplace, and that can really accelerate among all players in the fray. Go forward. So I think I've concluded our study as of now. I'm happy to answer questions along with Nandan and others. Thank you so much for your patient listening.
Well, thank you. That's an interesting note to end on. Thank you again, Govind, Nandan, and Karthik for your time and for your excellent presentations. And thank you to all the attendees for participating and contributing to the discussion. We will share the recording and the slides from this session along with this quarter's newsletter that goes out to the IGSN. It'll be in your inboxes tomorrow. And we'll now have a short feedback poll that will appear on your screen. Would be great to get your feedback on this session, and it'll help us plan the next few sessions of the year. And thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in our future sessions. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Okay.